Back in 2018, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse became something of a cultural phenomenon, due mostly to its innovative CGI techniques that were unlike anything ever seen before. And when its long-awaited sequel, Spider-Man Across the Spiderverse, came out, people hailed it as a modern masterpiece, with many saying it was even better than the first movie. But I just can't help but feel that the praise this movie has gotten is a bit overblown. I mean, sure, the movie is good, but is it really the best movie to come out in almost a decade, like some are claiming it is? Because while I once again will freely admit that the movie is good, I just think that it suffers from a few flaws that many overlook about it. And today, I'd like to go over what these flaws are, and why I'm concerned about the precedents this movie might set for the future. And obviously there will be spoilers ahead for Across the Spider-Verse, so if you haven't seen it yet, watch at your own risk. You have been warned. Okay, so to start at the beginning, I enjoyed Into the Spider-Verse, but had two major problems with it. The first being its animation, but I'll get back to that later. And the second was the way the movie would go back and forth between almost downright slapstick comedy and extreme melodrama. I mean, in the end it does manage to balance those elements pretty well, but it still makes it feel as if the movie doesn't know exactly what it wants to be, at least to me. Now, I will admit that Across the Spider-Verse didn't suffer so much from this problem, with it being able to juggle those elements with a bit more discrepancy. But that in and of itself leads to what I believe is one of the biggest problems with this movie. It's too dang long. Across the Spider-Verse is actually the longest animated American movie ever released as of 2023. And if you ask me, it doesn't need to be. Because as another reviewer pointed out, Miles' problems with his father, for example, get a little repetitive. I mean, he talks with his mother twice about it, and both times he gets the exact same point across. I mean, don't get me wrong, the way his mother supports him is sweet and all, but they could have easily either combined or cut out one of those conversations, and they would have still conveyed everything they wanted to. And that's not even getting into all the other conversations where half the time the characters are just staring at each other with dramatic music playing in the background. And it's like, I get it. They're trying to emphasize the inner nature of the characters, but it just goes on way too long most of the time. Like the scenes where Gwen is talking with her father, or when her and Miles are upside down on the building, or even when Gwen realizes she has to leave Miles behind while not knowing he's right there. Those moments of silent staring do not need to go on for as long as they do. They easily could have cut out 20 minutes of this movie and the audience wouldn't be missing anything important. Now, don't get me wrong here. As a writer myself, I know that it is very important for the inner conflict and emotions of the characters to be properly conveyed. But the problem is that the movie way overdoes it in this regard. And if it is too overdone, it might get to the point that audience investment will start to wane because they're no longer interested in the scene and characters and are just waiting for something else to finally happen. For example, Spider-Man 2 knew how to handle this much better. It knew when to stop and let the characters have their moments of emotion and inner turmoil, but it also knew when it had gotten its point across and when it was time to move on to something else. So, to put it simply, I believe Across the Spiderverse suffers from a pacing problem, and a slow one at that. That's what was nice about the Super Mario Bros. Movie, by contrast. It didn't need to dedicate half its runtime to the characters just staring at each other. It kept everything moving along at a much faster pace and only stopped a few times when it needed to for the more emotional moments, making sure they never outstayed their welcome. And another thing about this movie I believe people give too much credit to is the whole Spider Society cult thing. I mean, I know people love morally ambiguous and nuanced problems like that, but I'm sorry, the whole thing just doesn't really interest me. Especially because I believe people are too forgiving towards Miguel. I mean, that man is a completely mentally unstable jerk. Sure, it's tragic what happened to him, I won't deny that. But instead of finding out the true source of the problem, he concludes that all spider people must experience certain good and bad things, and that's just the way it is. I mean, I'm sorry, but the man is basically promoting widespread murder through inaction. Miguel is blatantly in the wrong here. And just look at his overall behavior, especially when things don't go his way. It's like, this man wouldn't even be trusted managing a McDonald's, and these people are practically letting him run an infinite number of realities? Seriously, the man is in desperate need of a therapist, and yet he scared almost everybody into submission around him. That's not right. I'm sorry, but I just find it a little hard to sympathize with him when even he basically admits he knows he's wrong and makes no attempt to work on fixing that. And why is he so mad at Miles for becoming Spider-Man? Everything he blames him for is Kingpin's fault. Miles didn't ask to become Superman. That only happened because Kingpin went messing around with other universes. Miles is totally free of blame, and yet Miguel acts like he engineered the whole thing to become Spider-Man. I'm sorry, but his behavior towards him just doesn't make a ton of sense. And just as a side note, while the movie on the whole does a pretty good job of explaining how the whole multiverse thing works, there are still some questions that are left unanswered. For example, one of Priver's, and please forgive me if I'm butchering that, canon events only happens because a bunch of people were already universe hopping. What would have happened if for whatever reason the spot didn't go to that universe? Would that particular canon event have never happened? Would the universe have found another way to make it happen? And does the nature of canon events mean that everything in Across the Spider-Verse's universe is to an extent predetermined or destined to happen? These are all questions that really don't have an answer to them, and they make trying to figure out certain things really confusing. Now I know that some of these questions, and particularly the true nature of canon events, will probably be addressed in the next movie, but even then I doubt some of them will get a proper answer, particularly the ones surrounding the circumstances of Privet's canon event and how the character's universe hopping directly affected it happening. But to get back to Miguel, what also doesn't help is that for all the movie's attempts at a morally gray, save the few at the risk of the many arguments, it's so obvious how the story is going to go concerning that next. Miguel is either going to admit or be shown that he was wrong and end up joining with Miles in order to make up for his past actions. Now, how exactly it reaches that conclusion, I can't say for certain. But my point is, If it's going to end with Miguel being proven wrong and him being forced to admit it, why even try the morally ambiguous angle in the first place? Isn't the whole point of gray morality that both sides are right and wrong to an extent, and that there is no easy solution? And yet, it's very easy to see in this case who's going to end up right and wrong here. And if you're watching this video after the next movie comes out and I'm proven wrong about this, you're most definitely free to call me out on it. But all that being said, there's still one other problem I believe this movie has, and it's the same one that its predecessor had, only worse. It's animation. Now, before you run to the comments to flame me alive, please hear me out, because I'll be the first person to say that the animation in this movie is very remarkable, and I'm not trying to take away anything from all the animators who undoubtedly worked very hard on it. Seriously, the achievements in this movie animation-wise are incredible, and I'll freely admit it. The problem, however, is that it feels way too excessive and even unneeded in certain places. And the best example I can give for that is the scene towards the end when Gwen finally has it out with her father. It's like they literally have the background melting behind the characters, and there's absolutely no reason for it. Once the scene is over, everything goes back to normal as if it never happened. And they don't even bother trying to convey to the audience whether or not that's actually happening or if it's just there to help convey the mood of the scene. And it's like, that has to be made clear to the audience, otherwise they're going to be totally confused as to why that's happening. And given the nature of the movie, that only makes it worse because the audience could end up scared that the universe is literally falling apart instead of listening to the conversation because they don't know if the melting effect is actually happening or not. But even setting that aside, why does the background need to be melting in order to help the audience understand the emotional significance of the scene? What happened to the characters just having a normal conversation? All these long pauses and visual aids aren't needed. The audience isn't stupid. Okay, maybe I'm getting a little overly heated here. Let me try and scale it back a bit. Now listen, all of this isn't to say that I think the movie is bad. I'm just trying to point out that it does have flaws that people are blatantly overlooking. But on the flip side, and to give credit where it's due, I feel that the best aspects of the movie are actually the most underused. Like, take The Spot, for example, which to me is hands down the best part of the entire thing. Seriously, this guy is absolutely hilarious and honestly makes for the perfect kind of universe-hopping threat with a personal vendetta. Any scene with him is instantly a complete riot to watch. That's how great he is. So it's really a shame that he's not in the movie more, even if he does make the most of his limited screen time. But seriously, Lord and Miller are comedy geniuses. They really are. And also, towards the end of the movie, when Miles runs into an alternate version of his uncle, I actually find that really interesting. The idea of running into an alternate version of somebody you know, and only being able to rely on what you know about the version you knew? I find that almost downright fascinating, but the movie doesn't go anywhere with it. But to be fair, the writers are clearly saving that stuff for the next part, so that last bit isn't even a real criticism. So what's my point with all of this? That Across the Spiderverse is a good movie and definitely worthy of praise, but not to the extent that people have been giving it. Because as I just spent the whole video pointing out, this movie does have flaws, but nobody seems to be acknowledging them. And I believe the reason for that goes back to its animation style. I wholeheartedly believe that if it weren't for how extensive and innovative the CGI was, it wouldn't have been nearly as well received. And I don't think that's a good thing. A movie should be able to stand on its own merits regardless of how it looks. If the greatest thing most kinds of movies have to offer is its visuals, then it has a serious problem. Now listen, you're free to disagree with me if you want to, but I just can't help but ask myself that if this movie was exactly the same in both story and appearance, but was in traditional animation, would people still be so quick to praise it? And honestly, while the animation here is really amazing and the animators behind it have my infinite respect, I really do believe a movie like this would have almost looked even better in traditional animation over CGI. If only because computers can make visuals unnecessarily difficult and provide limitations that hand-drawn animation simply doesn't have. But that whole thing is a video for another day. But whatever the reason is that everybody overlooks this movie's flaws, I'm just afraid that it'll send the wrong messages to everybody in Hollywood regarding what audiences want to see. Because what they might take away from the success of this movie is that animation is the only thing that really matters, and that they should be adding even more nuance and maturity to alleged kids' movies than they already are. But at the same time, I might be dead wrong. There's no telling what lessons Hollywood may take away from this. And considering the Mario movie managed to make even more money and was almost the exact opposite of Across the Spiderverse in those regards, with a more simple but fun animation design and a more kid-friendly tone, who knows what might be in store for the future of animation. Only time will tell, and until it does, I was only voicing some concerns about where it might be headed because of people ignoring the lesser parts of Across the Spiderverse. But again, I may very well be proven wrong, in which case that argument is pretty much irrelevant anyway. But I still felt it was something worth bringing up regardless. Alright, I think I'm going to end it there before I ramble on any further. So now I'd like to hear from you guys. Do you believe that people are ignoring the flaws of Across the Spiderverse and that it might even end up sending the wrong message to the Hollywood studios because of that? Or do you believe I couldn't be any more wrong about everything I said? And do you believe a major part of the reason for the movie being so praised was because of its innovative CGI? Or do you believe it was simply that good? However you feel, please let me know in the comments below. And sorry if I took my criticisms a little far in a few places, as I might have been overemphasizing my gripes with the movie in order to make my point. So once again, I'm sorry about that, and I mean no disrespect to anybody who worked on this movie. And as I've already said 100 times, you do not have to agree with my opinions in this video. I was just voicing a few concerns and criticisms I had regarding the movie. And if you think I'm dead wrong about everything I said, then that's absolutely fine. I only want to have a conversation with all of you. Nothing more. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.